The life of Violet Tweedale was one of some fantasy and interest. A Victorian woman, powerful and wealthy, in a time when women were not often such. She spent her days writing, socialising and hobnobbing with the elite. Described in some gushing and highly dated terms as a woman of many parts, she could paint a landscape and cook a dinner. She can write a book and make a shirt. She can etch a sporting scene and embroider the finest designs. She is a brilliant pianist and has the reputation of being one of the best political speakers of the present day. With her regular features, white hair, commanding presence, and strong personal magnetism, she is an undoubted power on the public platform. But this was not all Violet Tweedale was. She was also a keen ghost hunter, and from an early age had been scouring old estates in the hopes of uncovering the other side, with some degree of success. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to the final episode of Season 8. I'm Ben, your host as always, and it's good to be back right before Christmas. I thought this week, since it is like the last episode and we're coming up to Christmas and we've got the Christmas campfire coming up, I thought we'd stick to something a little bit sort of haunted and ghostly this week. Nothing too heavy, save the bigger, meatier topics for the start of next season. And instead, we're going to go this week for a little-known ghost hunter, actually. A quite eccentric lady from the late 19th, early 20th century. But I thought her story was kind of interesting, so I thought it fitted the Christmas theme quite well. On that note, if you do still want to get in your Christmas campfire submission, you can do so. There's been so many submissions this year. It's brilliant. There's definitely going to be more than one episode. So I'll get the first episode out as usual, Christmas Eve. And then any episodes more after that, whether it be 1 or 2 episodes, I don't know yet. It's going to be quite long. They'll come out in between Christmas and New Year. If you'd like to get your submission in, and you haven't done so yet, probably the cut-off point is going to be about the 21st-ish of December. I will try, if you do get it in late, I'll try and fit you in. Anyway, I'll do my best, just because I think if you've gone to the effort for writing in, even if it is a bit late, I should repay their effort. So I will do my best. But anyway, this episode, let's get on with it, shall we? This is The Life and Hauntings of Violet Tweedale. Born in Edinburgh in 1862, Violet Chambers was the eldest daughter of Robert Chambers Jr., a well-known and well-respected Scottish publisher who worked for and later edited the Chambers Journal, a weekly magazine founded by his father and Violet's grandfather, Robert Chambers, along with his brother William. The brothers had come from a turbulent background, having grown up to see their family fall from a rich, mill-owning position of wealth and business to impoverishment that led the family to move to Edinburgh after their entire wealth disappeared overnight following a bankruptcy from acting as a creditor to French prisoners of war, who borrowed money and then, shortly after, upped and left the country. Without a penny to their name, the two brothers focused on bookselling, shifting a stock of old second-hand books on a stool, and worked to slowly build a new business as teenage boys, learning to print, bind and publish along the way. A breakout hit with The Songs of Robert Burns, showcasing works by the famous Scottish lyricist and poet, afforded the two young boys a degree of success, which they continued to build on, going from strength to strength until 1832, when they published the first edition of what was originally called the Chambers Edinburgh Journal. Priced at a penny, it featured articles on religion, science and history, and proudly proclaimed in its very first issue to serve up food of the best kind for those hungry for knowledge, no matter their income. In later years, Robert Chambers would go on to publish his own work on the theory of evolution, Vestiges of the History of Natural Creation, which helped pave the way for Darwin's own infamous work. By Victoria's birth in 1862, the Chambers Journal's circulation had increased nationally and production had moved to London, whilst her father had a strong hand in the creation of the first Chambers Encyclopedia, which bolstered their already strong lineup of educational books and works in literature and the arts. Despite the family's heavy focus on knowledge and education, Violet followed the traditions of the day, and given the fact that she was a girl, was not sent to school at all. Instead, her principal education came from her father. Robert Chambers Jr. was an interesting sort. Having inherited his father's bookish interests, he was a tall, dark-haired man who some might have referred to as a country gentleman, whilst others would have simply called him eccentric. With a love for wildlife, music and sports, he practiced acting and ventriloquism. He played the flute and was an especially skilled amateur golfer, placing 10th in the first ever Scottish National Open. Perhaps most importantly for Violet, however, was his inherited love of books and writing, and she followed him daily, learning all about the publishing industry, reading works and editorials on poetry and literature, and visited the theatre, fostering a rich cultural education that saw her write her first public work as a young girl, a pantomime co-written with Andrew Wilson, Professor of Natural Science at the University of Edinburgh. Though she later recalled that her version of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves was simply appalling, it was a prime example of how Violet's unorthodox education, shadowing her father in his work and social life, saw her rub shoulders with a host of academics and Victorian celebrities, including people like the actor and theatre manager Henry Irving and the Baroness Angela Burdeck Coots, known as the richest heiress in England, infamous for both her art collection and philanthropy, after she and Charles Dickens co-founded a hostel for young women who had fallen to the streets. When her great-uncle, William Chambers, organised and paid for the restoration of St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, she was right there in the thick of the action, soaking up the cultural and religious history and helping the workers to remove and rehome thousands upon thousands of human skulls that lined the basement. When reading about Violet's early life, it can be easy to see the influences that would go on to shape her future literary and philanthropic careers, both of which were greatly encouraged by her father, who she had such a close relationship with. It was her father's less talked about eccentricities, however, that would perhaps shape her life in the more out there ways, that would see her go on to publish a series of works on ghosts, alternative spirituality, and psychical research that she is best remembered for today, even above the career that she would eventually carve out as an author. Violet's first memories of anything psychical or strange came about when she was just 6 years old. It was 1867, and Violet had recently moved into a new 3-storey townhouse with her mother and father, 2 brothers and 1 sister, along with their household staff. Sitting on the outskirts of Edinburgh, the house was part of a beautiful long row of curved terraces in Claremont Crescent. Brand new at the time, it was situated on what was then a developing suburb of the city, opposite a small public tree-lined garden that had once been part of the Royal Zoological Gardens and backed onto green fields flanked by large estates. Violet slept in the same room as her younger brother Albert, each having a bed occupying the opposite corner. At nights, they would both listen intently to the sounds of the rest of the house as the nurses made their way down to the kitchen for supper, leaving the bedroom floor at the top of the townhouse in an uneasy silence. Far down on the ground floor, we heard footsteps quietly and methodically ascending, and the rustle of a silk dress. We could hear quite distinctly when it arrived at the first floor, which was occupied by our parents. Then it passed on to the next flight of stairs leading to our floor. The sound of footsteps and the rustle of the silk dress became more and more clearly audible as it drew ever nearer. We could tell the second at which it passed from the last step onto the corridor which led past our half-open door. Then there was a thrilling moment or two when the tip-tap of the shoes and the swish of silk on the linoleum was quite loud, but the footsteps never halted. They always swept past the half-closed door and went on into a small room beyond, which was used for storing boxes. Then dead silence fell again. This sound became known to Violet and her brother as silk dress, and both seemed to accept that whatever it was that made the sound was a ghost, though the specific word was never used when they talked about it together. It was simply a visitor from the other world, as Violet described it, and that seemed to satisfy their childish curiosity quite enough. Neither she nor her brother felt scared or intimidated by Silk Dress. Rather, they would discuss the sounds together, questioning how the visitor left the small storage room every night when they never heard it leave themselves. The second character they heard was quite another matter, however. Rumpus, as it came to be known, would visit the children's sleeping hours on a fairly consistent schedule, waking them at 5 a.m. every 10 days or so. When Rumpus roused us brusquely from our slumbers, it was by means of a demoniac pandemonium. The room was in possession of them, and they crashed and banged and tossed about the furniture in the most reckless fashion. Crash went the wardrobe, bang went one chair after another hurtling across the room. Crash went wardrobe back into its place again, and clang went the fire irons. Rushing collisions and rappings on the window panes, thuds on the floor, rattlings and clatterings of crockery, jingling of brass, creakings and groanings of expostulation from the old sofa, clanking of the fireguard, a veritable tornado of noise, enough surely to awaken the dead. Yet out of the living, it only awakened us. No one else in the house ever heard it, and our vivid descriptions were, perhaps, naturally attributed to nightmare. Although the sounds of each bang, thud, scrape and boom were clearly distinctive, they were just that, sounds. Neither Violet nor her brother ever actually saw any of the furniture moving. They only heard the sounds as if it were. Despite having their experiences in the room downplayed by the adults in the house as little more than bad dreams, Violet and her brother were convinced otherwise. And whilst Rumpus sent Violet into a state of acute fear as she lay paralysed in bed waiting for the chaos to cease, it gave her just as much excitement and clearly paved the way for her later interests. It was also around this time that Violet went on her first ghost hunts with her father as they stalked out the grounds of the nearby Broughton Hall. Built in the 18th century, the domineering, sharply square structure of Broughton Hall was surrounded by a vast lawn, planted with trees and shrubs and concealed from outside eyes by a high stone wall that closed off the grounds via large, intimidating iron gates. Home to the Lord Provost, the comptroller of taxes, and then later a publishing family, it had been part of an estate for several decades by the time that Violet grew aware of the building. Perched right on the corner of Claremont Crescent, the old manor house quickly became the centre of a slew of rumours that filtered through the Chambers family, and Violet's father was happy to regale his daughter with anecdotes of the ghosts that were said to roam through the grounds. On dark evenings, Violet's father would suggest that they go and stalk out the grounds and hunt for the ghosts, and Violet would gladly accept, trotting excitedly behind her father as the two snuck through the gate and crept between the shadows of the trees, their keen eyes scouring the distance for movement, from the residents or otherwise. On most occasions, these outings would last for 30 suspenseful minutes before Violet's father would call the whole thing off, and the two would creep back to the light of the dim streets, returning home with no new ghost stories to tell, but full of excitement from the nocturnal excursion. On one occasion, under the darkness of a cold, cloudy November night sky, things did take a slightly different turn. We had emerged from our house about 9:30 and had reached the back of Broughton Hall. The house was shrouded in darkness and dead silence. Every blind was close drawn, and the suggestion was one of utter emptiness. My father and I were walking apart, I being right under the shadow of the walls, whilst he was in the middle of the paved court, which had neither hedge nor walls, but met the edge of the field running up to it. Suddenly I heard him whisper, "Hush," though we never did utter a word whilst close to the house. His arm was pointing in front of him. I stared ahead, and then I saw, clearly lit by the moon, a woman who had apparently just rounded the corner of the house. She was running hard, straight towards us, and her feet made no sound on the round cobblestones. Terror suddenly seized me, and I darted across to my father and got well behind him, seizing him firmly around the waist. The woman came on, rushing wildly. She had nearly reached us, and I was almost thrown over as my father faced her and backed to allow her to pass. I peeped round him and saw a woman, ghastly pale and distraught-looking, clad in a white nightdress. 2 long strands of black hair streamed out behind her, and her bare arms were outstretched in front. In a flash, she had passed, and absolutely silently, and I found myself lying on the ground alone, and my father vanishing in hot pursuit. Needless to say, I very quickly picked myself up again and joined the chase. Terror lent me wings, and in a minute or two I came up with him, standing breathless by the gate. "Vanished into thin air just as I reached her. That's always the way, you can't catch them," he said. Thrilled by their first unexplained experience after so many nighttime trips around the small estate, the two walked home, discussing what they had seen and tried to make sense of everything. Their conclusions all pointed to a singular answer, that the apparition had been nothing less than a bona fide ghost. Though they often returned to Broughton Hall, they never saw anything again, and it wasn't until Violet was 19 years old when the two would experience anything quite as unusual, and this time it was in a very different setting. It was a late afternoon over cream tea with their father and a family friend when Violet next experienced something that she struggled to explain. She had been visiting a family friend's estate, a large old house in Inveresk on the eastern outskirts of Edinburgh, surrounded by a floral garden and, just like Broughton Hall, a tall stone wall that shielded it from the outside world. Once filled with a small family, it was now left only to the elderly matriarch of the household, who had recently lost her daughter to a long sickness that had caused a considerable degree of mental instability before it consumed her. Sitting by a large bay window, the three drank tea and ate scones and engaged in idle conversation, when suddenly, breaking the serenity of the warm spring day, Violet's father stood up from his chair, exclaimed, "My God, there she is!" and pointed out of the window. Standing from her own chair, Violet looked out across the lawn to see what it was that her father was so excited about, which is where she spotted a woman walking lazily across the garden. There was a curious uncertainty about her movements. She walked like a blind person who has neither stick nor arm to guide her. Strangely enough, I never thought of connecting this woman with the ghost of a mad daughter. She looked so natural, so commonplace. Her hollow face was quite grey, and her dark hair was drawn tightly back from it, and rolled in an ugly knob behind. Her dress was of some dark material. Her boots were of cloth, and her hands and arms were rolled up in a stuff apron she wore. Not thinking that this woman was anything too unusual, it wasn't until she turned back to see the family friend cowering under the tablecloth that she had drawn up to throw over her head that Violet looked once more and finally saw her as an apparition of the woman's dead daughter. The figure walked through the grounds for a few more minutes before finally disappearing, after which it took her father several minutes more to calm down the old lady who had not ventured out from under the tablecloth the whole time. All of Violet's experiences with ghosts had been far from scientific, and had brought with them outcomes that had been unsure and confusing. But at least in the last two stories, the two Chambers, Violet, and her father Robert, were convinced of what they had seen. The early adventures around Broughton Hall with their father especially would go on to influence Violet's life in profound ways. By her late teenage years, following her fairly unorthodox upbringing and thrilling introduction to psychical research with her father, she had become an ardent believer in the other side, and despite being relatively religious, she had already begun looking for answers to questions that she felt the orthodoxy had failed to answer. Following Violet's somewhat lengthy education and what more or less accounted to as an apprenticeship working with her father, Violet moved to the south of France in 1888 when she was aged 26 in order to live and look after her sister, who had been advised to relocate to warmer climes by her doctor following a diagnosis of tuberculosis. It was a sabbatical that would not last especially long, however, and within a year of leaving Scotland, her father passed away, and she quickly returned to Scotland in order to help settle the estate, for which she was a major beneficiary. With her beloved father gone and Scotland seemingly increasingly lonely, Violet moved to London, seeking what she called a wider range of intellectual companionship. Financially independent, thanks to an incredibly healthy inheritance, Violet hopped around at first, skipping around West London hotels before settling in Whitechapel, where she founded and ran a women's shelter just in time to experience the dread of Jack the Ripper. Following this stint in the East End, she moved back to the West, to Berkeley Square, a far more upmarket residence sandwiched between Soho and Hyde Park. Throughout her early years in London, she quickly fell in with a crowd of well-to-do socialites, in large part thanks to a pre-existing network that she had forged through her work alongside her father in her earlier years. She hobnobbed with her cousins, Lady Campbell and Minnie Muriel Downey, a travel writer and author. Outside of the family, she spent time with many of the literary and academic giants of the time, including Eliza Lynn Linton, England's first ever salaried female journalist, and artist Lord Leighton. She described a life of easygoing opulence, including visiting the royal palace on several occasions in order to lunch with Queen Victoria herself. It was also around this time that she began socialising with the devout spiritualist, the Countess of Caithness. It was likely through the Countess and her sojourns to the south of France with her mother and sister, which she described as swarming with clairvoyants, where she first became drawn into the inner circle of high society's burgeoning spiritualist movement, though she was not entirely convinced of their beliefs herself. The Countess of Caithness had, for some time prior to Violet's London move, been deeply involved in spiritualism, having joined the New York Theosophy Society in the 1870s, and then donated a considerable sum in order to help spread the word of Madame Blavatsky throughout France in the early 1880s. Helena Blavatsky was a Russian-American mystic who had been making a name for herself throughout spiritualism circles globally, thanks to her prominent position as the de facto founder of the Theosophist movement, a peculiar melding of Western and Eastern philosophy and spirituality that drew influences from karma, reincarnation, the early scientific theories of evolution, and esoteric occultism. Violet, having already joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn following her arrival in London, was naturally all over the teachings of Madame Blavatsky, and was therefore more than excited to rub shoulders with the enigmatic leader when she arrived on English shores in the summer of 1889. Very quickly, Violet was busy attending lectures around the Theosophy headquarters in St John Wood and hoovering up as much newly published literature as she could manage. Truthfully, Violet had been looking for a solution to many of the inequalities and complex social problems that she'd been faced with as an adult and a woman, and had been investigating alternative belief systems for some time, and Theosophy seemed to fulfill all that she was seeking. It did help that she had had her own experiences with past memories, believing that she was, at one point in time, a Sicilian peasant, having recognised a series of landscape paintings and scenes from Sicily, despite never having visited the place. In another example, she had interpreted a dream where she was the head of a Hungarian gypsy clan as more than just imagination. One issue that she had been struggling with, however, was the beliefs and practices of many of the clairvoyants and spiritualists that were so intertwined with the Theosophist movement. Embracing the concept of, I made my present in the past, today I am making my future, she gave herself the task of visiting 50 seances around London, and if every single one turned out to be a farce or hoax, she vowed to turn her back on spiritualism entirely. It was no small feat to attend 50 seances, though it would have been made much easier given how popular a pastime it had been for socialite lovies at the time. True to her word, though, she stuck with the task, and it wasn't until her 30th seance that she witnessed anything that she believed could put the task to bed. This was in a session that was as unspectacular as could be, at least given the subject. The medium that she had visited was an elderly man whose office sat on Marylebone Road, a wide, busy street flanked by towering terraces. The noise of the street outside clattered in through the window of a small office that the old medium presented to Violet one summer morning. The room was entirely bare, with no furniture or decoration to speak of, outside of a small table in the centre of the room and a collection of 8 chairs slid up against the walls around the room. Far away from the dark, shadowy velvet plush dens, so ripe for trickery, the lack of any material or curtain over the windows whatsoever meant that the room was flooded with bright daylight, highlighting the scattered dust in the still air. Handing over 2 shillings and 6pence, the medium's fee for 15 minutes, the old man told her to simply choose your own phenomena and I'll see what I can do. Perplexed and intrigued by this simple command, Violet stared around the blank walls before turning her eye on the table and chairs. Pointing at the 4 chairs pushed up against the wall opposite, she asked the old man to make them skip across the room and leap up onto the table. The old man took her hands and asked her to lend him her power. At that second, my attention was distracted by a grating sound, and I forgot all about my companion. I saw the 4 chairs leave the wall and advance towards the table in exactly the position and tilted forward they would be if a human hand was dragging them across the floor. There appeared to be 4 invisible hands at work. Then, one by one, they were neatly balanced, one on top of the other on the table. When the manifestation was complete, I remembered the old man and looked round at him. He was watching the business, as keenly interested as I was. Good boys, I heard him murmur. How is it done? I asked him. He shrugged. The spirits do it. I don't. This was apparently enough to convince Violet that there was more to spiritualism and seances than she had first given credit for, though it also marked the end of her time dabbling in seances altogether, at least as a spectator. Over the coming years, she would discover that she seemed to have a unique talent for attracting spirits, souls, and apparitions that would eventually lead her to trying her hand at mediumship herself. But for now, she simply turned her back on spiritualism and focused instead on theosophy and the teachings of Madame Blavatsky and of women's suffrage, which, though in 1890 saw national campaigns, was still some time ahead of its status as a mainstream movement. A year later, Violet married Clarence Tweedale, the son of a retired Indian Army captain, on the 3rd of June 1891 in St. Peter's Church in South Kensington. On their marriage certificate, their professions were marked as simply gentleman and spinster. Over the next few years, the couple travelled around North America, taking in the United States and Canada, before settling back in England in a large walled estate in Cambridgeshire, much like the old Broughton Hall that Violet had spent her youth creeping around with her father, with a large stone wall that shielded and isolated them from the locals in the nearby village. Once settling, Violet worked on publishing her first few books, including in 1897 her first novel titled And They Too. With this newly serene life, one might have thought that the strange happenings around Violet may have subsided, or at least her interest in the unusual and unexplained. But in fact, it was quite the opposite. Clarence Tweedale was just as interested in psychical matters as Violet, and over their early years together, the two experienced several strange occurrences, including in their new home. It was a calm summer's day when Violet was lying ill in bed, when she heard the familiar tones of her piano downstairs in the drawing room echoing through the large vacant house. Angered that her butler had ignored her orders to turn away guests thanks to her current state of health, Violet listened to the tune playing out with skill and precision. It was the ability of the performance that truly gripped her, but it was the music's sudden end, right in the middle of a movement, 20 minutes after beginning, that forced her out of bed, with some frustration, to go downstairs and check who it was that had come for afternoon tea. I pushed open the drawing room door and entered. It was absolutely empty, but the piano, which had not been opened for several weeks, was open now. I went to the window which commanded the avenue, and not a soul was in sight. Flustered, Violet rang for the butler, who dutifully arrived and confirmed that he had not received a single visitor all day, as she had quite ordered. Confused, Violet asked him if he had also heard the piano music, to which he replied that he had, and the whole of the house staff had heard it over in the staff quarters, but they had all assumed that it was Violet up and out of bed and playing it herself. When the butler returned to work, he endeavoured to ask around just to make sure that no one had found their way into the house without his knowledge, but nothing ever came of it, and Violet never pressed the matter any further. About the same time, Violet also became aware of her own sensitivities towards such experiences. It was about a year after this incident with the piano when she and Clarence had been visiting their small cottage on the banks of the Thames when she felt an uneasy presence that appeared to centre around a specific area of the dining room. In that particular corner stood a drinks cabinet that contained a collection of wines and spirits ready to cater towards any visitors that needed entertaining. And Violet, though she had for many years been an ardent abstainer, found herself drawn to the bottles whenever she was nearby. It was as though she was being invited by some invisible person to pour herself a drink. In time, however, the feeling progressed into a full-blown apparition that seemed to develop as the days ticked by. Now and again I caught sight of a small oblong grey cloud hovering in front of the sideboard, but it was not till many months afterwards that I saw something more definite. The grey shadow had become the clearly defined shade of a small woman. She hovered about the spot in a wavering, undecided manner. It was apparent that she was seeking something. One day, in a flash, I recognised the truth. The suggestion came from her. She was inviting me to drink with her. Following this realisation, Violet and Clarence set about discovering who the woman may have been, and quickly found out that she had been something of a socialite herself who had eventually fallen ill and succumbed to alcoholism. It was no real upset then for Violet and Clarence to sell the cottage when they moved back to Scotland together a year later. Back on familiar turf, Violet and Clarence had retreated back to Clarence's original estate of Balcolly in Aberdeenshire. It was a beautiful Italianate mansion set amongst acres of woodland. Violet had her own apartment that looked over the pines, which was stuffed full of books and antiques. Whilst there, the couple entertained many of the day's finest, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which did perhaps suggest that the couple had not entirely shaken their interest in spiritualism. Indeed, Violet was just coming to the realisation that all of the strange happenings that she had experienced in life had much more to do with her own abilities as a medium. This was not an ability nor a skill that she took on gladly. Apparently, she was approached one day by a spirit of a young man that she had briefly known before his passing. Visiting her from what she called the other side, she was asked to contact the man's parents in order to relay a series of messages to them. Not thrilled by the prospect, given the loose social connection that she had so far fostered with the man's parents, she nevertheless did as the spirit asked of her, after discussing the matter with her husband and a few fellow occultists. For several years afterwards, she acted as a medium for the young man, passing messages on to his family during organised seances, until eventually the spirit organised for a new medium to take on the role instead. This was a strange period in Violet's life, one in which she claimed not to overly enjoy, and yet it did help to explain how she had, and would soon go on to witness so many strange apparitions. Now recognising herself as a sensitive and a medium, she described her newly understood abilities as a way to see, feel and understand a haunted room or place. She described it as seeing long drawn-out shadows that crept across the corners of rooms, the sensation of ice-cold water trickling down her back, and a sense of profound melancholy. It was these sensations that would go on to aid her in the next phase of her life, where she went back to her roots, exploring the gardens of Broughton Hall with her father as a ghost hunter. After watching the new century dawn and having moved back to Scotland, Violet spent the next 2 decades operating as a medium and then as something of an amateur ghost hunter that would eventually lead her to publishing a non-fiction work titled Ghosts I Have Seen and Other Psychic Experiences in 1919. It was in 1900, shortly before her practice as a full-blown medium had taken off, that she had one of her first fundamentally shifting moments. Wintering in their West End London home, in order to avoid the harsh and lonely winter months in the northeast of Scotland, Violet and Clarence had taken on a converted old farmhouse full of antique charm. Her bedroom, small with a low ceiling, was just big enough to house a full-sized bed that sat opposite an old fireplace set into the wall opposite, with an armchair perched just in front. It was here, whilst lying in bed one night, when she realised that she was not quite as alone as she should have been. It was a cold, snowy night, and I was lying in bed facing the fire and courting sleep, when I heard a sudden noise, which was totally different to the sounds made by the dying fire. Take a large sheet of stiff writing paper in your hand and crush it up between your fingers, and you will hear the sound I heard. Quite a loud and distinct noise if you happen to be in a very quiet room at an hour when all of the household had retired to bed. Naturally, I instantly opened my eyes and looked out into the room, which was lit brightly enough by the fire to make all of the objects it contained quite distinct. Sitting in the armchair in front of the dying fire was the image of a man, quite unaware that he was invading the bedroom of a young woman. He was lying back with his legs stretched straight out in front of him towards the fire. One of his arms hung over the arm of the chair, and in his clenched hand was a large piece of paper or parchment. His finely cut profile was clearly outlined. He was clean-shaven, and he stared into the fire, his chin sunk in high black stock. His hair was powdered and tied behind by a large black bow, and he wore bright blue cloth knee breeches, white stockings, silver-buckled shoes, and many gold buttons on his blue coat. I did not take in all of those details at once. I had ample leisure to do so later, for I suppose a full 2 minutes I stared very hard at him, and lay very still, knowing full well I was looking at a ghost. Naturally terrified and thrown into a panic, Violet did what just about anyone would do, and ducked her head under her covers, as her ears thumped with the sound of her own heartbeat, and she began to feel the beads of a cold sweat form on her brow. Eventually, however, she began to feel not so much fear, but instead an intense anger at her own unwillingness to face what she had professed to seek and understand for so long. Slowly and with some trepidation, she pulled back the covers in order to give herself a second look at the man in the chair. There sat that dark form between me and the fire. There he lay in an attitude of moody carelessness, watching the cooling embers as they faded from scarlet to pink, from pink to yellow, and then fell tinkling into heaps of white ashes. No statue was ever stiller. He did not move in the least, but sat more like an effigy of a man carved out of stone than a creature of flesh and blood. I closed my eyes and reopened them to test the fact whether I was awake or asleep and dreaming. No, I was broad awake, and the room was still fairly well lit. And there sat the phantom before the fire, the proud, well-set head with its powdered curls distinctly visible in the red glow of the firelight. I should think an hour must have passed thus, whilst I gazed at the figure before me, taking in every detail. There was no indication that he knew or cared for my presence. The figure sat like a stone. Having had so long to take in all the many details of the man's attire, Violet came to the conclusion that he must have been around 30 years old and a sailor from the 18th century. In his hand, she noticed him holding a crumpled-up ball of paper, tightly clenched between his fingers. As time ticked on, the fire slowly died out, and the image of the man faded into nothingness, while sleep eventually overcame Violet and sent her into a world of darkness. When she woke the next day, the man had completely disappeared. For several months afterwards, this man returned at weekly intervals, always announcing himself with the sound of someone crumpling a ball of paper in their hands, and always he simply sat in front of the dying fire, unmoving, like an old man desperate to warm himself from an eternal cold. Resigned to the fact that the apparition was going to continue to appear, Violet began seeking out the help of an exorcist to rid the room of its unwelcome guest, and eventually, with the help of the Catholic priest and writer, Father Reginald Buckler, the room was cleansed, and for the remaining 5 weeks Violet stayed in that house, the ghost never returned. A similar experience took place a few months later, this time in summer in a London hotel. Violet had been staying in one room, whilst her husband Clarence stayed in the adjoining room. This time it was around 4 a.m. when Violet woke after feeling a cold sensation on her arm that had fallen out from beneath the covers. Opening her eyes, she noticed a hazy grey fog creeping across the room. I drew in my arm hastily and opened my eyes. That tall grey something had approached much nearer to me, and now I could distinguish with perfect clearness the figure of a man, but such a wavering, fluid form that one moment seemed on the point of dissolving into thin air, and the next moment gathering itself together again in a clear-cut outline. For what seemed to me a long time I stared at the grey apparition. I felt a cold fear, A rigid horror creep over me, and but for the recollection of my husband's nearness and the open door between us, I might have fainted from pure terror. I thought of calling to him, but something sinister in that wavering shadow made me desist. At times, the form came quite close to the bed, but I could never see the face clearly. It was vague and undetermined in outline. In fact, not completely materialized. Not for a second did that wavering movement cease, that floating, shimmering motion twixt bed and window of what I knew to be the ghost of a man. Later that day, when the chambermaid came to the room, Violet asked her if a man had killed himself in the room before, to which the shocked maid confirmed that an army man had shot himself the night before last, just prior to Violet taking the room. On another occasion, Violet was visiting some friends in an old Scottish castle estate when she felt an uneasy presence in her room. The whole room itself had given her a horrible feeling of depressing melancholy, quite apart from the dark red velvet dressings and bricked-up fireplace that made the room dark and oppressive in the first place. On the dresser stood a large dressing mirror, which seemed to emulate an almost angry, violent and tense feeling, and one of the first things she did when being left alone was to throw a towel over it, to ensure that she would not be dragged into staring into its surface. Still, though, she felt that she was being watched by some malignant spirit. I became positively certain that I was being watched intently. Someone present in the room, though unseen by me, was watching my every movement. That someone violently resented my occupation of the room, was intensely hostile, and meant to make things nasty for me later on that night. Wherever I moved, that malignant eyes followed me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder at every crack of the furniture and the scratching of a mouse on the wainscot. It was in the stretches of dead silence that the presence became most imminent, most menacing, and I had a strong instinct to set my back against the wall and face right out into the room. As she dressed for dinner that night, Violet schemed upon several ways that she could avoid sleeping in the room, considering the idea of feigning illness after the dining was over in order to allow her to return home without having to spend the night. Suddenly, as she was weighing up her options, she heard footsteps begin to cross the room from behind her. My attention was suddenly drawn towards a soft, stealthy noise. Padded footsteps. Something had come near and was creeping warily round in front of me. I felt the eyes upon me. I was being regarded more closely. What was about to follow? I leapt to my feet and, raising my arm, made the sign of the cross. I bid you be gone in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. There was a moment's pause of utter silence. The atmosphere struck suddenly chill as ice. A curious sensation of emptiness crept over the room. I was alone, but for how long would I remain alone? Dashing downstairs to dinner, she made the best of the evening, and then at 10:30 p.m, when the other guests were either leaving to head home or shuffling back to their bedrooms to sleep for the night, she made her excuses and drove back to town, feeling not in the least bit guilty for lying in order to save her from the awkwardness of having to ask for a different room. As it turned out, the castle had quite the local reputation, which Violet soon found out, and she asked around to the locals. The rumours had it that the old owner, some old Sir Jim, had been in league with the devil and had killed several people after tossing them into the mansion's dungeons, before eventually being beheaded himself sometime in the 16th century. Unsurprisingly, it was his wing that had been allocated to Violet on the night that she was meant to have stayed. By now, Violet had become quite accustomed to seeing and experiencing ghostly apparitions, and was quite keen to better understand. Frustrated and annoyed with herself for never quite overcoming her fears and communicating with any of the ghosts that she had seen throughout her normal life, she endeavoured instead to launch a more controlled investigation in the form of a ghost hunt, and when the opportunity arose in 1914 for herself and Clarence to rent a house that had long been surrounded by rumours and hauntings, the pair jumped at the opportunity. Standing on Middle Warbury Road, Torquay, in the southeast of England, Castell was a rustic old Victorian villa that, by the time it came to the attention of the Tweedales, had seen better days. Violet and Clarence had taken a villa in the coastal town themselves and had been wintering there when they came across the local rumours of the house. Apparently, no one had been able to live there for over 30 years, and several had attested to having heard screams coming from inside or nearby the villa. The stories suggested that, for whatever reason, whoever had lived there had had some difficulty in keeping the doors locked, or even closed at all, and footsteps were heard storming up and down the corridors of the house at all times of day, almost constantly. The owner, a local builder who owned several properties in the area, was known to have had a terrible deal of trouble trying to sell or let the place, and so when Violet and Clarence heard the rumours and endeavoured to cosy up to him with the hopes of obtaining the keys on loan, it was with great relief that he passed them over to them willingly, though he assured them that the rumours of the hauntings were more nonsense than reality. When they asked him about the screams heard by the locals, he just simply laughed and said that they had come from a nearby villa whose owners kept peacocks in their gardens, and whose high-pitched calls pealed out constantly. For Violet, the place held little long-term interest. Hideous and inartistic in the extreme was how she described it after our first visit. Square, concrete and 3 stories tall with broken windows, birds in the chimneys, and more of the peeling paint lying on the floors of the dusty rooms than left on the walls themselves, its vacant history had seen the building fall into a state of near disrepair, and thanks to the war, no attempt at maintaining it had been offered. In her brief debut there, Violet made a preliminary sweep of the dilapidated rooms and came to the conclusion that the bathroom and one nearby small bedroom were the focal point of all the house's trouble. Locking up the front door as she left, she excitedly began drawing up plans with her husband on how they could go about investigating the property they now had free access to. In the first instance, they needed to decide when to visit. The night times, they concluded, would be too conspicuous and draw too much attention from the neighbours, and so instead they decided they would visit in between 1 and 2 p.m, when all good-mannered society would be preoccupied with taking luncheon. They started almost immediately after receiving the keys, and on the first day they spent a good 2 hours getting to know the layout of the rooms of each floor. Closing all doors, they returned to the ground floor and sat and listened. And then listened. After nothing broke the silence, they decided to draw a blank and call it a day, piling up a loose collection of sticks and dirt in front of the door to ensure that no one was entering when they were away. The next day, their return was much more interesting. Although the twigs and dirt by the front door had been completely undisturbed, they found every single door inside the house to have been thrown open. With their hopes a little more elevated, they returned to their lookout position and sat down and waited, just as they had the day before. Quite half an hour must have passed, when suddenly a click made us both look up. The handle of the door, but a couple of yards distant from me, leading into the small room, was turning, and the door quietly opened wide enough to admit the passing of a human being. It was a bright sunny day, and one could see the brass knob turning round quite distinctly. We saw no form of any sort, and the door remained half open. For perhaps a couple of moments we awaited developments. Then our attention was suddenly switched off the door by the sound of hurrying footsteps running along the bare boards on the corridor above us. My husband rushed up and searched each empty room, but neither saw anything, nor heard anything more. It had been a development over the previous day, but still nothing particularly definitive. Deciding to return home, they once more scoured the house, closing all the doors behind them as they went, and locked up the front door as they left. Once again, upon their return, they found all of the doors had been flung wide open. Unfortunately, that was all they found, and for the next 2 weeks, they returned daily but never saw anything more, just the bizarre phenomena of closed doors somehow opening throughout the house day after day. After a month or two, they decided to end their investigation, returning the keys to the owner, and though they couldn't say they saw anything especially specific, they still felt that they should confirm that they believed the building to be haunted, much to the owner's dismay, as he had been hoping they could have given him a clean bill of health and publicly made it aware that the haunting rumours were just that, unfounded rumours. He was so disappointed, in fact, that he offered the property to Violet for free, just for her to take it off his hands and alleviate him from the ground rent on an expensive, empty and dilapidated property. Violet thanked him for the offer, but turned it down. It would not be the end of the Castell investigation, however, and a few years later, in 1917, Violet was contacted by a friend, asking her to help him form a group of ghost hunters who could go into the house, and this time they would have a spirit medium in tow. By sheer coincidence, Violet's interest in the house had recently been reignited after she had finally heard the fabled scream one summer's day as she'd been casually passing the villa on a return trip home. Quite absent-mindedly, she passed by the still empty old house, not especially concerned anymore of its haunted reputation, when she heard what she described as a piercing scream that appeared to come from someone in abject terror. Looking around to see where the scream had come from, she saw no one. This development had piqued Violet's interest once more, just enough for her to agree to attend the ghost hunt and return to the villa. The friend that had contacted her had assembled a group of 8 people, including Violet. There was a spirit medium, a local builder, the friend, an old soldier, and 4 other women, though none were ever named. Just as before, the group decided to enter the house on a summer's afternoon, rather than at night, and, just as before, they stepped into the dusty hallways to find sunlight streaming through the broken windows. The house had fallen into a state of even deeper disrepair in the short time that she had been away, and still, when they entered, Violet found all the doors characteristically open on their hinges. As they toured the house, the medium took in the atmosphere of each room, one after another, before deciding to focus her attention on the master bedroom. Perching herself on an old box, the rest of the group huddled into the room and watched in silence as they all waited for something to happen. Just as we were all beginning to feel rather bored and tired of standing, the medium sprang to her feet with surprising agility, pouring out a volume of violent language. Her voice had taken on the deep, growling tones of an infuriated man who advanced menacingly towards those of us who were nearest to him. In a harsh, threatening voice, he demanded to know what right we had to intrude on his privacy. There was a general scattering of the scared party before this unlooked-for attack, and the soldier gave it as his opinion that the medium was now controlled by the spirit of a very violent male entity. I had no doubt upon that point. The medium, apparently possessed, let forth a torrent of abuse, threatening the group that if they didn't leave, he would be forced to use violence and remove them for himself. Then, just as suddenly as the possession, the medium sprang from their position, sitting on the empty box, and dashed towards the soldier of the group, attacking, drawing blood in the flurry of fists and hands. Violet and the builder jumped into the fray, grappling with the medium, and tried to pry them from the soldier, whilst everyone else fled into the garden, retreating to a safe distance. The scene being enacted was really amazing. This frail little creature threw us off like feathers and drove us foot by foot before her, always heading us off to the bathroom. We tried to stand our ground and dodge her furious lunges, but she was too much for us. After a desperate scuffle, which lasted quite 7 or 8 minutes and resulted in much torn clothing, she drove us out of the room and onto the landing. Then, suddenly, without warning, the entity seemed to evacuate the body he had controlled, and the medium went down with a crash and lay at our feet, just a little crumpled, dishevelled heap. Carrying the frail woman out to the garden, she slowly regained consciousness, quite unaware of what had just happened, though she may have had an inkling, thanks to the state of everyone's torn clothing, and everyone's haste to leave at once. Quite surprisingly, the soldier got back in touch with Violet a few days later, asking her to return with him once again. He had been quite shaken by the previous visit, but had left the villa feeling convinced that the whole affair had been entirely genuine, and now he wanted to go back and confirm his beliefs. Violet agreed, though it seemed several others from the original group politely refused the offer. When they met in the garden that afternoon, it was only her, the medium, the soldier and the builder, with the 4 other women flatly refusing to have anything more to do with the place. With some caution, the small group entered the house once more, with the medium leading the way back to the master bedroom, where she once again seemed to fall into a trance, and then became possessed by the same violent spirit that had attacked them in the prior visit. This time, however, the group was more prepared. Fighting off the medium, the soldier did his best to throw out some sort of religious exorcism, tossing out prayers into the chaos of the room. A violent back and forth ensued, And eventually, with a resigned slump, the medium fell to the floor once more, crumpled into a ball as an uneasy silence fell over the house. After a few tense moments, the medium eventually looked up from her position on the floor, tears streaming from her eyes, and between sobs doled out the whole story. Apparently, a previous occupant of the house, an elderly man struggling with his mental faculties, had been strangled to death by some wicked doctor, who was a foreigner, of course, as was the Edwardian way of othering the bad guys in any good tale. There was, as Violet herself admitted, no records of any murders having taken place in the building, leaving her to conclude that whatever had happened there, it must have managed to avoid detection. Whatever the truth, Violet never set foot in the old villa again. Following the events at Castell, Violet Tweedale seemingly let slip her ghost hunting ambitions. She did, however, continue to write on spirituality, spiritualism and psychical subjects, publishing 3 more books after her best-selling Ghosts I Have Seen hit the shelves in 1919, which included the tale of the haunted villa. Her fiction career was even more prolific, and in her lifetime she published 24 novels, many of which were mysteries and had supernatural undertones. Ultimately, she wrote it best herself when she concluded in Ghosts I Have Seen that it is a simple matter to compile a book of thrilling ghost stories if direct evidence is not given. And though she goes on to suggest that all of her stories are confirmable, the facts seem to suggest otherwise. Nevertheless, Violet Tweedale's life was one of some spectacular interest. A female publisher, author and ghost hunter, independently and uniquely educated in a time where near enough everything in life was tenfold more difficult for women from any class, her forward thinking led her to lead a life of some fantasy, and whilst it has now been largely forgotten, her writings do keep it alive, even if it is only in the corners of dusty old bookshops. So that was the little-known story of Violet Tweedale, and we'll talk a little bit about some of her stories after these short advert breaks. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's December, it's the holidays. What moments and things make you happy and cosy at home during this time? How do you stay cosy during these winter months? For some, wrapping up in a blanket with a mug of hot chocolate or watching a movie with family is the best way to spend the month of December. Therapy is also a fairly alternative but great way to bring yourself some comfort that never goes away, even when the season changes. Now, I personally would always recommend therapy. I think talking therapy is great. I think it's a benefit for everyone. Many times people think that it's, something that they should pursue when they're in trouble or having some difficult times in their life. I personally think it's just a benefit. It's always benefited me no matter when I've done it. And I've certainly had anxiety issues that I've talked about in the show before. And I think therapy has never solved the issue, but it's always been a big benefit. If you're thinking of starting therapy, why not give BetterHelp a try? It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, which you can switch at any time for no additional charge should you, for any reason, not get on with them. I have tried it out. I thought it was great. The therapist that I was matched with was fine, and I didn't have to try switching them, but, it's nice to know the options there if you do. So, find comfort this December with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/darkhistories to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/darkhistories. Cheers. Welcome back. So I thought, like I say, coming up to Christmas, we do something a little lighter, a little haunted, a little bit ghostly. And I came across Violet Tweedale, some time ago actually, about midway through season 6, I think. And I sort of just scribbled her name down into a Google Docs that I've got that has sort of a bunch of episodes that I sort of thought about coming back to. And I uncovered her biography and I thought let's do that for this last episode of the season. You know, I thought it would be sort of ghostly and fun. I think what I found most interesting about sort of ghost stories of this time, that sort of late Victorian, Edwardian sort of period, is the difference between then and now, in the sense that commonly in modern times, people tend to see sort of religion, ghosts, and science as sort of three very separate things that just can't coexist, or that contradict each other directly. But I think what I liked about back then was the religious people tended to still believe in the power of science, and yet they still had quite out there views on life as well at the same time, like views about souls and the supernormal. And there's just so much less resentment and division, and almost like a sense of wonder and, you know, what if, you know, and what about, a lot of what aboutism, you know, and I just really like that. Say, Violet Tweedale was incredibly religious. She was a strong Christian. She told a story in her biography about her mum fell ill with what the doctors thought were cancer, and so she basically prayed to God to make her mum better. She said that she like made a bargain with God, and that she offered him something that was, you know, of high value to her, if in return she would heal her mother. And she said that apparently God accepted this bargain, and he got better. So clearly, she, you know, she had religious tendencies, and yet here she was exploring sort of like quite, I mean, like, well, a lot of Eastern philosophy, a lot of sort of like spiritualism and, you know, occultists kind of beliefs and theories, you know, quite esoteric stuff. And yet she found no incompatibility. And I think that's really interesting. As in terms of sort of Violet Tweedale herself, I do like focusing on people like her, you know, with dark histories. I think these days she's basically largely forgotten, but, you know, she was some character. She was completely eccentric, you know, she was very unusual, and she was very ahead of her time in a lot of respects. You can say that she was 100% reliant on her privilege in life, and she was, and that shows itself in her biography in many ways. But you still can't take away from the fact that she still did what she did. You know, there were a lot of people in life that have her privilege and do nothing, and yet she was there. She was, you know, obviously had a strong belief in her experiences and of what she believed, and she, you know, wrote books about it. She wrote several books about it. One which, you know, turned into a bestseller. So, you know, you have to sort of respect her for, despite having the privilege, still acting on her beliefs and still having the conviction behind them to write these books. I think actually it's interesting that in her biography she is, and I mean this in, well, she's incredibly pretentious. She's intensely pretentious. She name drops like an absolute good one, and she spends most of the time just talking about what a lovey she was. And despite that, she seems to downplay her time running a women's shelter, which I think was a huge deal at the time, and was a really impressive thing that she was doing. And yet somehow she sort of resigns that to a very small part of her book, almost like it wasn't important. It was, you know, it's basically a throwaway line. You know, that I basically ran this sort of shelter, and that's that. She seems to be far more interested in telling you about who she had lunch with, which I find absolutely bizarre. But I mean, I suppose it says a little about her. But, you know, I thought that was amazing that she did that anyway. I think it's no surprise that a lot of her sort of beliefs in theosophy and stuff sort of again show themselves in the biography. And, you know, of course, these people tend to think that their soul is more evolved than others. You know, when she talks about her past lives, she was never, you know, a bad person or a poor person. She was always some leader or whatever. She had this past belief that she had a past life as a gypsy in Hungary, right? But she wasn't just any normal gypsy. Oh, no. She was the leader of the clan, of course. Yeah, of course. And, you know, these sort of supernatural abilities that she now has sort of go in with that theosophical idea that she was sort of higher up the evolutionary ladder than others that didn't have those abilities. it's very self-important and pretentious, and it goes hand in hand with a lot of the rest of her book. I personally don't really have a lot of stock in things like theosophy. I think it was really just a woman sort of manipulating Eastern philosophy in a time when that was very exotic, and melding it with Western beliefs that were easy to accept, and at the same time giving people that idea that they could be more, which is very attractive, and or that they perhaps were more, which again is pretty attractive. So I don't really put a lot of stock in any of her sort of writings about that, and honestly, I don't put a lot of stock in any of her ghost stories in her book either. I sort of pointed out at the end, she said as a sort of conclusion, it's a simple matter to compile a book of thrilling ghost stories if direct evidence is not given. She then goes on to then say that, although she's obscured a lot of the facts in her book, they're all confirmable and, should be confirmable. That's just not true. I looked up every single one of these stories. I dug as deep as I could with the information that she gave, and I found no trace of anything. In many occasions, I couldn't even find names of houses or hotels that she was talking about, using the information that she was given, because she does sort of pepper her stories with names and places, just enough to give it sort of ground the stories in credibility. But when you look for those names and places, they just lead nowhere. And there was no doctor murdering anyone in Castell. She says that perhaps it was, undiscovered, but there would still be bodies, and I found no reference of any bodies, no death certificates, nothing. So, I don't really put a lot of stock in her stories, but I take nothing away from the fact that they're fun and exciting and potentially true. Who knows? I personally am skeptical, but that's just me. I still enjoyed them greatly, and I still enjoy her life greatly. I think, her upbringing was really unique and interesting, and I feel like her father was probably a really fascinating guy. He's one of them people where I wish I could have met them. Violet, I wish I could have met her to some degree, but I fear she was just a little bit too much of a lovey for me. But her father, I think, was surely a fascinating old eccentric. And both of them led very interesting lives. So I hope you enjoyed the story anyway. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about Violet and, ultimately the ghost stories, because, hey, it's Christmas, right? So, yes, thank you very much for listening this year. With that, I will leave the episode there and the series there. And I will also wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Thank you so much for listening throughout the year. Obviously, I will do the Christmas campfire episode, but just in case you don't listen to that, maybe you listen to it late, or you just don't, or it just doesn't interest you, I just want to say, wish you a healthy, happy New Year, prosperous, and Merry Christmas. I hope you enjoy your time, no matter what you do, if you celebrate it or not, if you spend time with your family, if maybe you just get a day off work, whatever happens, I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much once more for listening. It's been a long but fantastic season. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I'll be back in the new year with season 9, which is shocking to think of. And until then, if you'd like to contact me, you can do so all the usual ways. contact@darkhistories.com is the email. All the links to all the social media and such is in the show notes. If you would like to check out the website, it's darkhistories.com. There you can go and you can find ways that you can support. Support is always welcome. I'm just a one-man band, and this is quite daunting sometimes, sort of managing this. So any support is always welcome. There are many ways you can do it. There's sort of books, merchandise. I've got a Patreon with advert-free episodes, things like that. Anyway, even just sharing it with your friends or writing a review can be a fantastic way of support, because Lord knows I am dreadful at promoting the show. I can't do it very well at all. I think, the fact that the show's grown the size it has is purely down to you and your efforts to help me with that. So, thank you so much. Anyway, thanks once more for listening. Like I say, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays. I hope, I hope you have a great one. Cheers. Sleep tight.